I grew up in the shadow of my older brother, Daniel. To the outside world, he was the golden child, the one everyone admired, charming, athletic, and quick with words that could melt even the most skeptical teacher or neighbor. But to me, he was the source of nearly every ounce of pain I carried through childhood. I was 3 years younger, the quieter one, the bookworm, the one who never seemed to measure up. If Daniel got an A, my B+ was a disappointment. If Daniel scored the winning touchdown, my attempts at the same sport were brushed aside as not trying hard enough. Our parents adored him, practically worshipped him, and yet they barely tolerated me. What no one else knew was that behind closed doors, Daniel made it his life's mission to make mine miserable. He broke my toys and blamed me for losing them. He whispered lies to our parents, convincing them I'd stolen his allowance, or skipped school, or ruined things he himself had destroyed. And every time, they believed him. Every single time. By high school, I stopped even trying to compete. I carved out my own world, focusing on studies and working part-time jobs just to feel like I had some control over my life. Daniel, meanwhile, cruised through with his easy smile, dating whoever he wanted, leaving a trail of heartbreak behind him, and somehow always landing on his feet no matter how much trouble he caused. But nothing could prepare me for what he did later. Because tormenting me wasn't enough, he set his sights on the one person in the world I thought I could trust completely. My wife. When I met Rachel, I felt like I'd finally caught a break. She wasn't impressed by flashy charm or smooth lies. She loved depth, conversation, and stability, the things I had always built my life around while Daniel was too busy chasing fleeting thrills. We fell hard and fast. Within 2 years we were married, and I thought I had finally outrun my brother's shadow. But Daniel doesn't let go. He never had. It started subtly. At family gatherings, he'd make jokes at my expense, the same way he always had, but now they were aimed at Rachel too. "Are you sure you didn't settle?" He'd laugh in front of everyone, patting me on the back like it was harmless. Or he'd wink at her across the dinner table, the kind of wink that made my skin crawl. Rachel always brushed it off, but I saw the way his eyes lingered, the way he leaned just a little too close when talking to her. I told myself I was imagining it. That I was paranoid because of our history. But then came the day that destroyed everything. I'll never forget the night Rachel sat me down, pale and trembling, and told me the words that knocked the wind out of me. "I'm pregnant, and it's not yours." I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded so hard I thought I was going to pass out. And when she finally whispered whose child it was, I felt the floor drop beneath me. Daniel. My own brother. The man who had made my life hell since childhood had now crossed the final line. He had betrayed me in the one way I never thought possible. I left that night. Packed a bag and stayed in a hotel because I couldn't look at either of them. And yet, life has a cruel way of twisting things further. Because just when I thought it couldn't get worse, karma delivered an unexpected hand. Our parents, the ones who had always worshipped Daniel, finally saw him for who he was. They disowned him after the scandal spread through town. His charm couldn't cover up what he had done this time. And when they passed away not long after, they left everything, their entire $20 million estate, to me. Not a cent for Daniel. Now he's at my door. Broke. Desperate. Pleading. And for the first time in my life, I get to decide his fate. The night it happened, I was sitting alone in my study. The house was silent, the kind of silence that presses on your ears until you can hear your own heartbeat. I had poured myself a glass of bourbon, not because I needed it, but because there was something ritualistic about holding a drink while thinking about how drastically life had changed in just a few short months. For the first time in my life, I wasn't Daniel's little brother. I wasn't the second best, the afterthought, the one always cleaning up the mess. I was a man with $20 million worth of inheritance in my name, a sprawling estate, and more financial security than I ever imagined. But wealth doesn't erase betrayal. And every dollar in my bank account felt heavy with the knowledge that the one person I had trusted more than anyone, Rachel, had shattered everything. I hadn't spoken to her in months. After the truth came out, she tried calling, tried texting, even showed up once, sobbing on the porch like a woman who realized too late what she had thrown away. I couldn't bring myself to open the door. The image of her confessing the pregnancy, her eyes wide with guilt, her hands trembling, was burned into my mind. Forgiveness wasn't even a word in my vocabulary anymore. So when I heard the knock that night, a slow, deliberate pounding on the heavy oak door, my stomach clenched. For a second, I thought maybe Rachel had come back again. Maybe she'd finally brought the child with her, desperate for me to acknowledge it, to play some role in a twisted version of a family that never should have existed. But when I opened the door, it wasn't her. It was Daniel. And he looked nothing like the golden boy I had grown up with. His hair was a mess, greasy and unkempt. His once carefully ironed shirts and tailored jackets had been replaced by a wrinkled hoodie that looked like it hadn't seen a washing machine in weeks. His face was gaunt, hollow-eyed, with the kind of desperation you only see in people who have lost everything. "Hey, little brother," he croaked, his voice rough. He tried to smile, but it came out twisted, more of a grimace than anything else. I didn't answer. I just stood there, gripping the edge of the doorframe, waiting for him to get to the point. He shifted on his feet, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "Can I come in? Just for a minute?" The audacity of it almost made me laugh. He wanted to come inside my home, the home I now owned because our parents had finally seen through his act. The same parents who, for decades, had held him up as the shining star while treating me like a dim flicker. But I stepped aside, wordless, and let him in. Maybe I wanted to hear what he had to say. Maybe I wanted to watch him squirm. He walked into the living room and looked around, his eyes lingering on the paintings, the antique furniture, the glass chandelier overhead. I could see the envy in his expression, that same look he had worn all our lives whenever I had something he wanted. But this time, the tables had turned. "Nice place," he muttered. "Mom and Dad always said you had an eye for understated class." That comment nearly made me snap. He still couldn't resist the backhanded compliments, even standing there with nothing left. "What do you want, Daniel?" I finally asked, my voice low, sharp.
He exhaled heavily, ran a hand through his greasy hair, and for the first time, I saw genuine vulnerability in his face. "I messed up," he said. "I know I did. Look, I can't take back what happened with Rachel. I can't undo that. But I'm drowning here. I don't have a job, I don't have money, and nobody will touch me. I burned every bridge, and now you're all I've got." The silence stretched between us. He looked at me with eyes that were both pleading and defiant, like he hated having to beg, but hated even more that I was the one with the power to deny him. "You're unbelievable," I said finally. "You ruin my marriage. You get my wife pregnant. You disgrace our family. And now you show up here, expecting me to fix it for you? Why? Because I always cleaned up your messes before." His jaw tightened. "Because you're my brother." The word stung. Not because it held any warmth anymore, but because he still thought it meant something. I leaned forward, my voice dropping lower. "Brothers don't do what you did to me. You stopped being my brother the moment you touched Rachel." His face flushed with shame, or maybe anger. He dropped onto the couch, his hands pressed together like he was praying. "I just need a chance, man. Alone, a place to stay, something to get me back on my feet. I'll pay you back. You know I will." I laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "You'll pay me back? With what? Lies? Betrayal? Empty promises?" He winced, but didn't argue. The truth is, part of me wanted to throw him out right then. To slam the door in his face and let him rot in the mess he'd made of his own life. But another part of me, the part that had been crushed under his shadow for years, wanted to savor this moment. To make him sweat. To see him sit in my house, stripped of the arrogance that had once defined him, begging like a dog for scraps. I poured another glass of bourbon and handed it to him. He took it with trembling hands, muttering a quiet thanks. As he drank, I studied him. This wasn't the same Daniel who had stolen girlfriends from me, who had lied to our parents to get me punished, who had laughed while I sat grounded in my room. This was a broken man, beaten by his own choices, finally realizing that karma doesn't play favorites. And yet, as I looked at him, I couldn't help but feel the dangerous stirrings of something else. Pity. But pity is a slippery slope. And with Daniel, pity could be deadly. Because I knew deep down that if I gave him an inch, he'd take everything. Again. So the question wasn't whether I could help him. The question was, should I? And that night, as he sat there in my house, waiting for me to decide his fate, I realized I had a choice I had never had before. For the first time in my life, Daniel's future rested entirely in my hands. Daniel stayed on the couch that night, clutching the bourbon glass like it was a lifeline. He dozed off eventually, his head lolling to the side, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. I stood in the doorway watching him for a long time, wondering how many nights of my childhood I had spent staring at the ceiling, wide awake, because of something cruel he had done to me. And now here he was. Vulnerable. Desperate. In my house. I could have thrown him out then and there, but something inside me wouldn't let go. It wasn't forgiveness, not by a long shot. It was something colder, darker. I wanted proof. Proof that he hadn't changed. Proof that my instincts about him, my lifelong hatred and distrust, were justified. So I decided to test him. The next morning, I woke him with the smell of coffee and bacon. He stumbled into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, looking more like a stray dog than the golden boy my parents once adored. He sat at the table, wolfed down the food like he hadn't eaten in days, and finally leaned back with a sigh. "Thanks, man," he said, his voice still hoarse. "It's been a long time since someone, cared enough to cook for me." The manipulation was subtle, but I caught it. That was Daniel's specialty, sowing guilt in others to get what he wanted. I didn't flinch. "I want to make you a deal," I said. His head snapped up. "Anything. Just name it. I'll give you a place to stay, some money to get back on your feet. But only if you prove to me you've actually changed. No lies. No tricks. No manipulation. Just hard work." He frowned, suspicious. "What do you mean?" I smiled, but it wasn't a friendly one. "I inherited Dad's rental properties, remember? Half the tenants have been complaining about leaky pipes, busted walls, you name it. I need someone to handle the grunt work. You do it for 3 months, no excuses, and maybe, I'll consider giving you more." His eyes widened. "You want me to be your handyman? You want my help? That's the price." He stared at me, his pride warring with his desperation. Once upon a time, Daniel would have laughed in my face. But now, with nowhere else to go, he nodded slowly. "Fine. I'll do it." And so the test began. I sent him to the worst unit first. A rundown duplex where the ceiling leaked every time it rained and the basement smelled like mildew. I gave him tools, supplies, and just enough instructions to keep him busy. Then I waited. For the first week, he actually worked. I drove by one afternoon and saw him covered in dust and sweat, hauling out broken drywall. He waved when he saw me, like he wanted me to notice his effort. For a moment, I almost believed he was serious about changing. But by the second week, the cracks started showing. The tenant called me, complaining that Daniel hadn't shown up for 2 days straight. When I confronted him, he spun a story about being sick, about how he had caught something from the mold. His eyes darted as he spoke, and I knew instantly he was lying. Still, I gave him the benefit of the doubt. "Fine," I said. "Rest. But if you miss another day, you're out." He promised it wouldn't happen again. It did. This time, I found him at a bar downtown, laughing with some woman draped across his arm. He didn't even look embarrassed when I walked in. He just shrugged. "What? A guy can't have a little fun." My blood boiled, but I held it in. I wasn't finished yet. "Fun doesn't pay bills," I said coldly. "Finish the work, or you're done." That night, he came back to the house drunk, stumbling through the door like he owned the place. He crashed on the couch again, mumbling apologies that slurred into incoherence. I stood over him, fists clenched, every muscle in my body screaming to drag him outside and leave him in the street. But I didn't. Not yet.
Because the test wasn't over. The next morning, I tried something different. I handed him an envelope. Inside was $500 in cash. "What's this for?" he asked, blinking. "Advance payment." A sign of good faith. His eyes lit up, greedy and hopeful. He thanked me over and over, swearing he'd use it to buy supplies, to get food, to straighten things out. I watched him leave. And then, because I knew him better than anyone, I followed. Sure enough, he didn't go to the hardware store. He didn't even go to the grocery store. He went straight to the casino on the edge of town. From the shadows, I watched him sit at a blackjack table, the money I had just given him spread out in neat stacks, his grin growing wider with each hand. For hours, he played. For hours, I seethed. By the time he stumbled out, pockets nearly empty, I was waiting in the parking lot. The look on his face when he saw me was priceless, caught red-handed, exposed like the fraud he had always been. Funny place to buy supplies, I said, my voice dripping with venom. He froze, stammering. It's not what it looks like. Don't insult me, Daniel, I snapped. You're the same man you've always been. A liar. A cheat. A parasite. His face twisted, rage flashing through his eyes. You think you're better than me? Just because mom and dad finally threw you a bone? You think that money makes you some kind of saint? You're nothing without me. The words hit harder than I expected. Because deep down, some part of me had always feared they were true, that my entire identity had been shaped by fighting against him. But as I stood there, watching him unravel, I realized something. I wasn't fighting against him anymore. I had already won. And that was when I decided his test was over. But the real punishment hadn't even started. For weeks after the casino parking lot confrontation, I tried to pretend I'd crossed some invisible finish line. I told myself that watching Daniel fail so spectacularly was enough, that he'd finally learned and that, in time, he'd crawl out from under whatever hole he'd dug for himself and become someone who could at least look me in the eye without smirking. But the truth is uglier and simpler. He was tenacious in his pathological way. When defeat didn't break him, it made him meaner. He kept showing up at the rentals. He'd patch a ceiling or glue a skirting board in the morning, then disappear for hours. He borrowed my truck and returned it with cigarette burns on the leather and a stench of booze. Tenants complained. I evicted one who paid rent late to cover a bill Daniel had promised he would handle. The day I signed the eviction papers and handed the tenant back his safety deposit in cash, I felt something I'd never expected: relief. The world was finally behaving like it should, responsibility had consequences. And yet Daniel kept breathing down my neck. One clear October afternoon, as the maples in the driveway began their slow blaze of orange, I was finishing an inspection when the gate opened and Rachel walked up the path. She looked different, hollowed out, as if whatever color she'd once had been wrung from her, but the sight of her was like someone opening an old wound with salt. I hadn't expected her. She had stopped answering my calls months ago. I set down the clipboard because everything about the moment demanded I stop what I was doing. She didn't come alone. Daniel trailed behind her, shoulders hunched, with a stroller tucked under one arm that made my stomach drop so hard I thought I might be sick. There, wrapped in a tiny blanket, the whimper that slipped into the open air belonged to a child with my features, dark hair like mine, small fists, the same stubborn chin. My hands went numb. For a long second I couldn't place rational thought. All I could feel was the raw, animal shock of being confronted with the physical proof of the betrayal, an echo of my life I couldn't deny. Rachel's eyes were red, but she looked like she'd made a decision. She stepped forward and spoke directly to me, without a hesitation: he needs help. I can't do this alone. There are smaller betrayals that bruise and fade. This one was molecular. Watching her hold our child, his child, was like watching gravity reverse. Daniel's face showed something that might have been shame, but he quickly masked it with a practiced plea. Look, he said, as if he were negotiating a debt. I know I messed up. I know you have every right to hate me. But the kid, he didn't ask to be born into this mess. I'm asking you to be the man you promised you were once. Help us. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to spit. He used that same tone, calm, wounded, so familiar it made me sick, The one that had gotten him out of curfews and detentions, the one that got him money and sympathy and second chances. He was weaponizing fatherhood, weaponizing pity. Why now? I asked. My voice sounded smaller than I wanted. Why come to me? Why not to your parents, your friends, anyone else you burned? Daniel's eyes flicked to the house and then back. They disowned me, he said simply. You know that. They walked away. I have nowhere. Rachel has the baby and no money. Child support is, he shrugged, helpless by design. I don't want your pity. I want a job. I want to help raise him. I want to earn back whatever I can. The part of me that still remembered the small boy who'd stolen my allowance, who'd broken my toys and smiled as I cried, wanted to close the door and never look back. The part of me that had been raised to be decent, taught to be steady, reliable, honorable, felt the tug toward responsibility. There's a particular cruelty in having the moral high ground handed to you when your heart is a coal pit. I told him the terms again, same as before, but sharper, a formal arrangement, a plan in writing, oversight. No unsupervised weekends, no access to the estate accounts, a background check, and if he so much as stole a screw from a worksite, he was gone. The smell of the paper I slid across the table felt like a confession. Daniel took the pen as if he'd been rehearsing this for months. He hesitated only for a heartbeat, then signed. Rachel watched with a look that was almost relief. She thanked me in that quiet way that meant she had measured and remeasured every step before arriving at this doorstep. For a moment, as I watched them walk away, stroller pattering over my stone path, I allowed myself to believe this could be pragmatic cruelty, tough love aimed squarely at making a mess into a lesson.
That illusion lasted precisely 16 days. On day 16, a man with a badge came to the front door. He was in his 50s, tired-eyed, and he introduced himself as Detective Martin from the County Homicide Task Force. My coffee went cold in my hand. My throat shoved a dozen questions that died on the floor like fallen leaves. "Do you know a Daniel Mercer?" he asked. His voice was careful and flat. "We have reason to believe he was involved in a break-in last month, forced entry at a storage facility on the north side. It was a clean job, professional. He's not a primary suspect, but he's one of the people linked to the account used to rent a pickup truck that night." He watched my face for my reaction. I kept my voice steady because I needed my voice to be the armor I'd learned to build over the years. "I don't know about that," I said. "Daniel's been staying with me, doing property work. If he's involved in something criminal, tell me what you need." The detective's lips thinned. "We also have reports of someone trying to sell off electronics online, resale of items matching what was taken. The account used to list the items was traced to a burner phone purchased with a credit card that had been recently maxed out and has a billing address listing." He hesitated. "An address connected to a business that lists you as the owner." My heart slammed into my ribs so hard I saw stars. "What?" I said, unable to feel the cold that had moved along my skin. "You think I arranged this?" Detective Martin held my gaze. "We don't think. We're saying there's circumstantial evidence to be investigated. There's a subpoena for records. We need access to your rental logs, your truck rental histories, any surveillance footage you might have from the properties." In my mind, I replayed the image of Daniel at the blackjack table, the cigarettes in the truck, the busted HVAC unit he'd fixed. Each small transgression glowed now like a neon sign. The instinctive thing was to shut him down, to point him out, to hand over any proof and let the law do what the law does. But there was another piece of the puzzle forming, something else Daniel had been building while I slept. That night, I cleaned his bedroom while he worked at the properties. I have no excuse. That impulse felt less like spite than survival. I found a shoebox under the bed filled with receipts and small, glossy envelopes. Most were mundane: lottery tickets, cigarette packs, the odd business card. Then at the bottom of the box, wrapped in a receipt from a private notary, was a slim legal-looking packet with my name on it. Inside, an audio file on a cheap thumb drive and a photocopy of a document. My stomach flipped as I read the headline signature on the photocopy. It wasn't forged, it was a copy of a recent voicemail transcript that included a baritone voice, not Daniel's, on the other end. The photocopy bore a notary stamp, a declaration that the audio had been authenticated. I plugged the drive into my laptop with hands that trembled. The file opened and the voice that filled my study was my own. "You'd be surprised what a man will sign when he's anxious about his past," I heard myself say. I could hear my voice in the recording from some meeting I'd had months ago at a bank, years before the inheritance, something about a clause in my parents' will they'd asked me to witness. I sounded tired, a little tipsy, the room hazy. In the recording I was arguing, in a voice I do not now recognize as mine, that perhaps a codicil could be arranged. Someone suggested that in a scenario where one child behaved catastrophically, a conditional disbursement could be set. I could hear the counselor across the line asking if I understood the gravity. The next line on the thumb drive sent ice through my bones. A different voice, low, clipped, mocking, Daniel's voice. "You think you can keep it all," he said in the recording. "You think they'll just hand you 20 million and you'll be happy? Make them prove it. Make them fear losing you." My mouth went dry. The recording wasn't just a recollection, it was a trap, one I had apparently walked into willingly in a moment I barely remembered. Beneath the audio were files, messages, photos of me at a meeting with our parents' lawyer, documents I'd signed and initialed, small things that suggested my involvement in a chain of events leading to the very will clause that had left Daniel unprovided for. In other words, not only had he betrayed me with Rachel, he had been keeping receipts on me, evidence he could weaponize. There are two ways you respond when someone holds a knife to your throat: you fight or you bend. I had some illusion of hard choices being simple, black and white, but life, as it turns out, is smudged. Daniel had found leverage. Not because he was clever alone, but because for decades he'd watched the way parents and power and pride moved, and he knew where a man's weak spots lived. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my study, listening to the recording over and over, trying to recall any conversation I'd had that fit. Memory is a traitor when guilt colors it. Details warp, motives hide. I remembered sitting with my father in his study, the two of us going over numbers, his hands shaking as he talked about the future. I remembered a mention of a codicil, but it had always sounded like a legal abstraction, something lawyers used to keep heirs honest. Had I said something stupid? Had I, in a moment of exhaustion, agreed to a clause without understanding its teeth? The next morning, I called the lawyer listed on the paperwork and demanded a meeting. He was calm, professionally shocked, and asked me to come down with any proof. I handed over the thumb drive and watched his face as it turned from polite to alarmed and then protective. This could be used as evidence of coercion," he said quietly. "Or it could be evidence of manipulation. Either way, we need to proceed carefully. If someone recorded you without consent, that's one thing. If you signed documents under duress or with false promises, that's another. Do you want me to involve the authorities?" 100 responses crowded my mind. I thought of the detective at my door, of the eviction notices, of the tenants who'd trusted me to be fair. I thought of Rachel's eyes and the baby in the stroller, of the small fist that had curled around my thumb twice and then let go. I thought of Daniel, his greedy grin, his garish bravado. And then I thought of my parents, the way they had loved Daniel not because of merit, but because the nurturing of a certain voice satisfied them, and of the will that had finally cut him off. It felt like the world had folded into a single point, and on that point everything I had been was going to be pressed thin. I left the lawyer's office and went straight to the storage facility where Detective Martin had mentioned the break-in. The security guard at the gate recognized me from a previous inspection and let me in without fuss. I walked past the units, listening to my footsteps echo against metal doors until I reached the unit number Martin had flagged. The lock had been cut and left dangling where it had been broken. Inside, a row of shelves stood bare where electronics once sat. My chest tightened. On the concrete, a single playing card, a joker, lay face up, as if someone had been playing a game with me this whole time. I took out my phone and dialed Daniel. He didn't pick up. He never did when the world was about to tilt.
At 2 in the afternoon, I went back to the house. The stroller was gone. The ground where Rachel and Daniel had stood was scraped by tiny shoe prints. The back gate was open. In the lawn, near the tree where my father used to hang his hummingbird feeder, someone had scattered the same glossy envelopes, like confetti, receipts, torn business cards, the edges singed. A message was scratched into the dirt with a blunt stick, "Help me." It could have been pleading. It could have been a joke. It could have been a setup. Before I could decide which, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was a short video, 30 seconds long. The first frame showed a shadowy figure at the edge of a well-lit room. A voice, oddly familiar, said, "You should have known better than to play God." Then the camera panned. There, clear as daylight, was the notary's stamp I'd seen. There, on a table, were papers with my name, and on the far side of the room, a man I recognized standing with his back to the camera, Detective Martin. The clip ended there, abrupt as a snapped wire. The text that followed 3 seconds later was a single line in caps, "We both have something to lose." I stood in the yard, phone cold in my hand, and felt a new kind of fear, not for my safety, but for the fragile architecture of truth. Evidence can be protected. Evidence can be destroyed. People can be made to look like saints with the right edits, or like devils with the right leaks. Daniel had cashed in his last miserable chips for leverage. And someone, Detective Martin, the message implied, or someone pretending to be him, was holding both ends of the rope. I had choices to make: call the detective, turn over everything to the police and risk that the recording would be used against me, expose Daniel immediately in front of witnesses and risk pushing Rachel and the baby into the cold, or play along, bind him tighter with the very legalities he'd used to corner me, and attempt to extract the truth from beyond his defenses. Each option carried with it a cost measured in lives, reputation, freedom. My phone buzzed again. Another message: "Come to the warehouse, midnight. Bring the copies." No signature. No voice. Just a command. Outside, the wind moved the last of the maple's orange leaves like a slow, deliberate applause. Inside, my study clock ticked like a metronome marking the seconds between decision and consequence. And I realized, impossibly, that I had already begun to live the life my brother had always wanted me to have, the life full of choices other men didn't have to make. Only this time, the stakes were not trophies or attention. They were blood and law and the small, helpless thing that had my nose. I took a breath. My hands didn't shake as much as I thought they would. I had to choose. But before I could decide which blade to take up, my phone rang. Unknown number. No caller ID. I answered. A voice, cold, dry, impossibly calm, said just 2 words. "Don't come." The words, "Don't come," echoed in my ear long after the line went dead. I stood there in my study, phone clutched tight, the ticking of the clock suddenly unbearable. The rational part of me said to listen, stay put, protect myself, let the authorities handle it. But when had rationality ever been enough with Daniel? My entire life had been defined by his chaos, his betrayals, his talent for pulling everyone into the whirlpool with him. If I sat still, I knew exactly what would happen: he'd twist the narrative again, and this time I'd be the one left holding the blame. I poured another bourbon, letting the heat burn down my throat, and sat in silence until the house itself seemed to breathe around me. By the time the clock struck 11, I'd made my decision. I grabbed the envelope of copies, tucked the thumb drive into my pocket, and slipped a small recording device into my coat. If Daniel wanted a game, I'd play, but I'd make sure every move was documented. The drive to the warehouse was a long stretch of cracked asphalt that cut through the industrial district. Midnight air pressed cold against the windshield, and each streetlight buzzed overhead like a warning. My hands stayed steady on the wheel, but inside, adrenaline coiled like a live wire. The warehouse sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, its corrugated steel siding catching faint moonlight. The lot was empty, too empty, except for one truck idling near the loading dock. Its headlights were off, but the engine's hum carried in the silence. I parked a distance away and approached on foot, every step deliberate. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes, too loud, but I didn't dare stop. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and inside the warehouse, a single light bulb swung lazily from the rafters, throwing shadows that seemed to stretch and bend with every flicker. And there he was. Daniel stood in the center, hands shoved deep into his hoodie pocket, a smug half-smile plastered on his face. Rachel was nearby, clutching the stroller, her eyes wide and glassy with fear. The baby whimpered, the small sound cutting through the cavernous space like a blade. "You came," Daniel said, voice echoing. "I told you not to. You really don't know how to follow directions, do you?" "Where's Martin?" I asked, keeping my voice even. "He was the one who sent me here." Daniel chuckled. "Martin's not coming. He never was. That text? That was me." The blood in my veins turned to ice. "The video, the messages." "Fabrications," Daniel said with a shrug. "Bits of truth spliced together with a little help from a friend who knows his way around editing software. You'd be surprised how easy it is to make someone look guilty when you've got the right scraps of their life lying around." "The audio of you talking about the codicil? Real. But the rest? Smoke and mirrors." I clenched my fists. "So this was all just another game to you? Another chance to drag me into your mess?" His grin widened. "Not just a game. An opportunity. You've got $20 million, brother. You've got houses, cars, businesses. I've got nothing. But together, we could make something work. You cover for me, make sure the cops stop sniffing around, hand over a few million to keep things quiet, and I promise to disappear. No more problems. No more scandals." Rachel shook her head, her voice trembling. "Don't listen to him. He's been planning this for months. He told me he'd use the baby as leverage if he had to." My chest tightened. "You used your own child?" Daniel's eyes flashed. "Don't act so self-righteous. That kid is as much your problem as mine. You think people won't whisper when they grow up? You think they won't ask questions about timelines, about who their real father is? You think you can hide from this forever? No, little brother. This child ties us together whether you like it or not." The baby began to cry, high and sharp, and Rachel rocked the stroller, tears streaking down her cheeks. I felt a rage so deep it was almost blinding. All my life, Daniel had destroyed everything good I touched, my childhood, my marriage, my peace, and now he was using an innocent child as a bargaining chip. I stepped closer, pulling the envelope from my coat. "You want money? Here." I tossed it onto the floor, the papers spilling out across the concrete. His eyes lit up, greedy, but before he could bend to grab them, I pulled out the recording device and held it high. "You think you're the only one who knows how to play this game? I've been recording everything. Every word you've said tonight. The cops don't need doctored videos when they've got your own confession."
For the first time, Daniel's confidence cracked. His smile faltered, his hands twitched in his pockets. "You wouldn't," he said. "You've always been too soft. That's why I could always walk all over you. You don't have it in you to bury me." I stepped closer until we were nearly face to face. "Try me." The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The baby's cries filled the void, Rachel's sobs the only other sound. And then, with a suddenness that made my heart stop, Daniel lunged. His hand shot out, not for me, but for the stroller. Rachel screamed, clutching it tight, but Daniel shoved her aside with a force that sent her sprawling. The stroller tipped, the baby wailing louder as it teetered dangerously near the edge of the platform. I moved before I thought, diving forward, my hands gripping the stroller just as it toppled. My body slammed into the concrete, pain shooting through my shoulder, but I held on, pulling the baby back to safety. Rachel crawled to my side, clutching the child to her chest, sobbing uncontrollably. When I looked up, Daniel was gone. The echo of the warehouse door slamming shut was the only trace he'd left behind. For a long time, I just knelt there, breath ragged, my whole body shaking. Rachel rocked the baby, whispering soothing words through her tears. And I realized something I should have known all along: Daniel would never stop. He wasn't just a liar, a thief, a manipulator. He was a storm, destructive, endless, and incapable of change. I had thought karma would catch up to him. But maybe karma was waiting for me to decide. And now, with his voice on my recorder, his crimes catching up, and his child, my wife's child, crying in my arms, I knew the next move would be mine. The only question left was, would I destroy my brother completely, or finally let him destroy himself? For the next 72 hours, I lived in a kind of suspended reality. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside my house, a car engine backfiring, a knock at the door, the scrape of branches against the siding, made me jolt as if Daniel himself were clawing his way back inside. Rachel had moved into the guest room with the baby. Despite everything, I couldn't turn them away. Not after what nearly happened at the warehouse. She walked on eggshells, barely speaking, like she knew she was the ghost of a wound I couldn't close. But the baby didn't care about betrayal or inheritance or the sins of his parents. He cared about warmth and food and arms to hold him. And against my will, against the deep bitterness lodged in my chest, I found myself holding him more than I expected. Late at night, when Rachel collapsed from exhaustion, I'd take the small boy in my arms and walk him through the halls of the estate, whispering lullabies I didn't even know I remembered. His tiny fist would wrap around my finger, and for fleeting moments, the world felt simple again. But Daniel was still out there. The detective's words haunted me, and the text message about the warehouse still burned in my mind. Was Martin involved? Or had Daniel been bluffing the entire time? I couldn't risk guessing wrong. If Daniel had leverage, he'd use it. And if he didn't, he'd create it. That was his nature. By the fourth day, I'd had enough. I wasn't going to wait for him to show up again. I needed to end it on my terms. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I called Detective Martin directly. We met at a diner off the highway, the kind of place where truckers came for coffee at 3 a.m. and nobody cared about who sat in the corner booth. Martin looked worn, his tie loosened, his eyes scanning the room before settling on me. "You sounded urgent," he said, sliding into the booth. I placed the recording device on the table and pushed it toward him. It's all on there. Daniel's confession. His threats. His attempt to use his own child as leverage. Martin's brows furrowed. He picked up the device, his thick fingers surprisingly gentle with it, and nodded slowly. We've had our eye on him for a while. Theft, fraud, a few suspicious fires linked to properties he was near. But no hard evidence. If this is clean, it might be enough. I leaned forward. I don't care about charges for petty theft. I don't care about the scams. What I care about is making sure he can't touch me, or Rachel, or the baby, ever again. Martin's gaze was steady, unflinching. You're saying you want him locked away? I nodded. Or worse. The silence that followed was heavy. Martin finally set the device down, folded his hands, and said, "The law doesn't do worse. But if what's on here checks out, he won't see daylight for a long time. That's the best I can give you." I left the diner with a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief because the wheels of justice were finally moving. Dread because Daniel was never the type to go quietly. He'd fight, claw, burn the earth down before letting himself be caged. And I was right. That evening, as Rachel rocked the baby to sleep upstairs, I sat in my study going over rental reports when I heard it, the unmistakable crunch of tires on gravel. My stomach twisted. I checked the cameras. Daniel's beaten-up sedan sat at the end of the drive. I didn't even have time to lock the doors before he was pounding on them, shouting my name. "Open up, little brother. I know what you did. You think you can trick me, set me up with your cop buddy? You think I don't have ears in this town." Rachel appeared at the top of the stairs, clutching the baby, terror written across her face. "What do we do?" she whispered. "Stay there," I said firmly. "No matter what happens, don't come down." I opened the door, just enough to face him. Daniel looked feral. His hair was wild, his clothes stained, and his eyes burned with manic energy. In his hand, he clutched a crowbar. "You ruined me," he spat. "You always wanted this, didn't you? To see me crawl, to see me suffer. Well, congratulations. You win." He raised the crowbar slightly, the metal catching the porch light. "But if I go down, I'm taking you with me." I didn't flinch. "Then do it. Swing that crowbar, Daniel. Kill me right here. Because if you don't, Tomorrow morning, the cops are going to have everything they need to bury you under charges you'll never crawl out of. His face twisted, caught between rage and calculation. He stepped closer, the crowbar shaking in his grip. You wouldn't. You've never had the guts. I stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind me. The autumn wind cut sharp between us. Try me, I said, echoing the same words I'd spoken at the warehouse. For a long, tense moment, we just stared at each other. The years of rivalry, of pain, of betrayal, all of it condensed into that single heartbeat. His hand tightened, his knuckles white around the crowbar. Then headlights swept across the driveway. Red and blue lights followed, painting the night in flashing color. Daniel's eyes widened as squad cars screeched to a halt. Officers jumped out, weapons drawn. Drop it, one of them barked. Drop the weapon now.
For a second, I thought he'd resist. I thought he'd go out swinging. But the fight drained from him all at once. He dropped the crowbar, the clang ringing out like a final note. His hands went up, his face pale. As they cuffed him and read him his rights, he caught my eye. There was no plea in his gaze this time. No manipulation. Just hatred. Pure, unfiltered hatred. This isn't over, he hissed as they dragged him to the squad car. You think you won, but you'll see. You'll see. The door slammed, and just like that, he was gone. I stood on the porch long after the sirens faded, the cold biting at my skin. Rachel came down eventually, the baby asleep in her arms, tears streaking her face. Is it really over? She asked, her voice trembling. I looked out into the darkness where the taillights had disappeared and shook my head slowly. No. Not yet. But it's the beginning of the end. Because Daniel wasn't just my brother. He was my shadow. And shadows don't vanish easily, not even under the brightest light. The trial became the stage Daniel had always craved. For years he'd been the golden boy at family dinners, the charming son in the community, the one who could talk his way out of anything. Now he sat in an orange jumpsuit, shackled at the wrists, but he hadn't lost the smirk. To him, the courtroom was just another audience. Reporters swarmed outside every day. A family betrayal story, spiced with money, infidelity, and crime, was blood in the water. They snapped photos of me walking in, whispered speculation about Rachel, and even tried to get shots of the baby. I had to hire security just to keep cameras out of our windows. Inside the courtroom, Daniel's lawyer spun tales like spider silk. He painted Daniel as a desperate man, abandoned by parents who had favored one child unfairly, a man pushed to the edge by my supposed scheming. The audio files I'd given Detective Martin were dissected, challenged, and, thanks to forensics, authenticated as genuine. The lawyer argued they were taken out of context, that Daniel's confession was the rambling of a man under stress, not an admission of guilt. But the jury wasn't blind. They heard his threats, his manipulation, his casual mention of using his child as leverage. They saw the casino footage, the receipts, the trail of small crimes that built into a mountain of character evidence. Piece by piece, the mask cracked. Still, he fought. Every time our eyes met across the courtroom, he mouthed words only I could see, "This isn't over." Rachel testified, voice trembling but firm. She admitted her role, her betrayal, the shame that had hollowed her out. She wept when she spoke about the baby, how Daniel had tried to turn their child into a bargaining chip. Her words landed heavy, not just with the jury, but with me. Hearing her voice those truths aloud was like watching her dig a knife into her own chest, over and over, to show the court the wounds she carried. And then it was my turn. I took the stand, every eye on me, the weight of decades pressing down. I told them about our childhood, how Daniel had been the golden child, how I'd lived in his shadow, how he'd twisted every opportunity to make me small. I told them about Rachel, the betrayal, the night she confessed the pregnancy. My throat tightened, but I forced the words out. And finally, I told them about the warehouse, the stroller tipping, the crowbar on my porch. By the end, the courtroom was silent. Not even the scribbling of reporters' pens filled the air. The prosecutor closed strong, painting Daniel not as a tragic figure but as a predator who had spent his life feeding on the people closest to him. The defendant, he said, voice ringing out, is not a victim of circumstance. He is a man who has made a career of destruction. And now it's time for accountability. The jury deliberated for 2 days. 2 long, torturous days where I barely left the house. Rachel tried to cook, tried to talk, but silence hung over everything. The baby was the only light, his small laughs breaking through the tension like sunbeams through storm clouds. When the verdict finally came, I sat in the courtroom gripping the edge of the bench so tightly my knuckles turned white. On the charges of fraud, theft, and attempted extortion, the foreman read, "We find the defendant guilty." Daniel's smirk faltered for the first time. His jaw clenched, his eyes flicked to me with pure venom, but there was no escape this time. The judge sentenced him to 20 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 15. The gavel came down. Just like that, the storm that had consumed my life was caged. But the strange thing about storms is that even when they're gone, the damage remains. Rachel and I walked out of the courthouse together, the baby nestled against her shoulder. The cameras flashed, reporters shouted, but I barely heard them. My mind was a blur of relief, grief, and something darker I couldn't name. That night, after the baby was asleep, Rachel sat across from me at the kitchen table. Her eyes were tired, her voice quiet. "What happens now?" she asked. I stared at her for a long time. The woman who had broken me. The woman who had been complicit in my brother's worst betrayal. And yet, the mother of a child who had no say in any of it. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I know this, he doesn't get to decide our lives anymore. Not yours. Not mine. Not his son's." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Do you hate me?" I thought about it for a long time. "Yes," I said finally. "And no. I don't know if I can ever forgive you. But I don't hate the child. And he deserves more than what Daniel gave him." We sat in silence, the weight of our shared mistakes between us. In the weeks that followed, Rachel moved into a small apartment across town. We agreed to co-parent, not because I was the father, but because the baby needed stability, and I couldn't turn my back on him. Every time I looked into his eyes, I saw traces of myself and of Daniel, and it terrified me. But I also saw innocence, a chance to break the cycle. As for Daniel, the last I saw of him was the day they led him out of the courtroom in chains. He turned his head, eyes locking on mine, and mouthed one last promise: "I'll never forgive you." Maybe he won't. Maybe 20 years from now, when he's released, he'll come back with the same hatred burning in his chest. Or maybe prison will break him in ways I never could. Either way, I know one thing for certain: I survived him. For the first time in my life, I'm not the one living in his shadow. And if he ever comes back, I'll be ready. Because family might share blood, but sometimes, blood is poison. And the only cure is to cut it out. Time has a strange way of dulling sharp edges while leaving the scars behind. The trial, the betrayal, the storm that was Daniel, at first, it was all-consuming. But as the years passed, the chaos quieted. What was once an open wound became something more like a deep scar across my life, always there but no longer bleeding. It's been 12 years.
The estate has changed since then. The sprawling house that once felt like a mausoleum for my parents' favoritism is now a home that breathes with laughter and noise. Not mine, not Rachel's, at least not in the way people once expected, but the child's. The boy who carried the stain of his conception has grown into someone bright, curious, and untainted by his father's sins. His name is Michael. At first, I struggled with him. Every time I looked at his face, I saw Daniel's features, his sharp cheekbones, the same defiant chin. But children have a way of carving out their own identities. Michael grew into himself, not into Daniel. His laughter sounded nothing like my brother's mocking chuckle. His eyes, though Daniel's in shape, carried warmth I had never seen in him. Slowly, without even realizing it, I stopped seeing the ghost of betrayal and started seeing the boy in front of me. Rachel and I never reconciled romantically. The betrayal was too deep, too raw. But as co-parents, we found a rhythm. She rebuilt her life, went back to school, earned a degree, and started working with nonprofits that help single mothers. Her penance, perhaps, but also her redemption. She apologized countless times over the years, but eventually, the apologies stopped. Not because she stopped feeling guilty, but because she realized the best apology wasn't words, it was raising Michael with love, with stability, with none of the manipulation or favoritism we had grown up under. And me? I became the steady presence. The one who showed up to school plays, who taught him how to ride a bike, who sat with him late into the night when he was scared of thunderstorms. I never lied to him about where he came from, but I waited until he was old enough to understand. When he turned 10, he asked me the question I'd been dreading. Why isn't Dad here? I looked into his eyes and told him the truth, not the full sordid tale, but enough. That his father had made mistakes, that he was paying for them, that sometimes people hurt others in ways they couldn't undo. I didn't tell him about the crowbar on my porch or the stroller tipping at the warehouse. Those details could wait for adulthood, if ever. What mattered was that Michael knew he wasn't responsible for any of it. He nodded, thoughtful, and after a long pause he said, "Then I don't want to be like him." And in that moment, I knew we were breaking the cycle. But the shadow of Daniel never fully left. Every year, like clockwork, I receive a letter from the prison. They come in thick, uneven scrawls, addressed to me, to Rachel, sometimes even to Michael. Most of them are rants, blaming me for stealing his life, accusing Rachel of betrayal, calling Michael the proof that blood can't be denied. I never show them to Michael. I keep them locked in a drawer in my study, a grim reminder of the man my brother chose to become. Last year, one letter was different. It was calmer, almost reflective. He wrote that prison had opened his eyes, that he wanted a chance to meet his son when he got out. He asked me to help him, to be a brother again. I burned that letter. Because some doors can never be opened again. Daniel is eligible for parole in 3 years. I know he'll apply. I know he'll try to use whatever scraps of charm he has left to convince the board he's reformed. Maybe he'll even succeed. The world has a strange way of letting men like him slip through the cracks. But this time, I won't be caught off guard. Michael will be nearly 15 by then, a young man with his own mind, his own choices. If Daniel tries to reach him, I'll be ready to protect him with everything I have. Not because of revenge, not because of old wounds, but because no child deserves to be poisoned by the same shadow I grew up under. And as for me, I've found peace in a way I never thought possible. The inheritance, the money, it stopped mattering years ago. What mattered was learning that family isn't defined by blood. Blood is a thread, fragile and often tangled. But loyalty, love, protection, that's what makes someone family. Daniel was my brother by blood, but he made himself my enemy by choice. Michael is not my blood, but in every way that matters, he is my son. When I tuck him in at night and he calls me Dad, I realize something that makes all the pain, all the betrayal, all the scars worth it. Daniel may have won every battle growing up, but in the end, I won the war. Because while he sits in a cell, haunted by the empire of lies he built, I walk free with the only inheritance that truly matters. Not $20 million. Not even vindication. But the chance to give a child the life my brother and I never had. And that is something Daniel can never take from me.